Peter, or Pete as he was known around the sprawling Thompson estate, had been the groundskeeper for 7 solid years. He wasn't just someone who mowed lawns and trimmed hedges. Pete poured his heart and soul into every blossom he nurtured, every blade of grass he coaxed into lush perfection. He treated the gardens like they were his own living, breathing masterpieces. He was a quiet, observant man, preferring the company of his plants to the social whirl of the wealthy family he worked for. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson and their 2 young children were often away, leaving Pete to his peaceful domain. He rarely crossed paths with them, and certainly never intruded on their lives. That was until the day his quiet dedication collided with a moment of unexpected crisis. It was a breezy afternoon in late spring, the kind where the air hums with the promise of summer. Mr. and Mrs. Thompson were in the city for some social engagement, and the kids were supposed to be inside with the nanny. Pete was meticulously deadheading roses near the far end of the property, humming a tuneless melody under his breath, when a flicker of movement caught his eye. He glanced over towards the decorative pond, a picturesque feature complete with a small stone bridge and a miniature waterfall. He saw Lily, the Thompsons' youngest, a bubbly 5-year-old with pigtails the color of sunshine, wobbling precariously close to the water's edge. Pete frowned slightly. Lily wasn't supposed to be near the pond unattended. He straightened up, intending to gently steer her back towards the house. But then, in what felt like agonizing slow motion, it happened. Lily reached out, perhaps to touch a lily pad or a shimmering dragonfly, lost her footing on the mossy bank, and tumbled forward with a splash that shattered the afternoon quiet. Time seemed to warp. Pete's heart leapt into his throat. He didn't think, didn't hesitate, didn't analyze. Instinct took over. He sprinted across the manicured lawn, his work gloves flying off, adrenaline surging through him. He reached the pond's edge just as Lily's bright yellow sun hat bobbed briefly on the surface before disappearing under the murky water. Without a second thought, Pete plunged into the pond. The water was shockingly cold and deeper than he'd anticipated. He gasped as the icy shock stole his breath. He fought through the tangle of pond plants, his eyes scanning the cloudy depths. Then he saw a faint shimmer of pale skin beneath the surface. He reached down, his fingers brushing against something soft and fabric-like. He grabbed hold, pulled with all his might, and hauled Lily up and out of the water. She was coughing, sputtering, and tears streamed down her face, mixing with the pond water. Pete, soaked to the bone and shivering, held her tightly, relief flooding him in a warm wave. Lily was safe. He quickly checked her over. No obvious injuries, just shaken and soaking wet. "It's okay, sweetheart. You're all right now," he murmured, his voice rough with emotion. He wrapped his arms around her, trying to offer warmth and comfort, and carried her towards the house, his own clothes dripping a trail of pond water behind them. By the time they reached the main house, Lily's sobs had subsided into hiccups. He settled her gently on a porch chair and called for the nanny, Mrs. Gable, explaining what had happened in rushed, breathless sentences. Mrs. Gable, initially pale with fright, quickly wrapped Lily in a warm blanket and thanked Pete profusely, her relief palpable. Later that evening, the Thompsons returned. Pete, still slightly damp but mostly recovered, assumed the incident would be met with gratitude, perhaps a relieved smile or a word of thanks. He couldn't have been more wrong. Mrs. Thompson, a striking woman with a sharp, polished demeanor, descended on him like a storm cloud. Her voice, usually reserved and refined, was laced with icy fury. "Peter, Mrs. Gable told us about this incident at the pond." Her tone was accusatory, not grateful. "I want to understand exactly what happened." Pete explained, carefully and calmly, how he'd seen Lily near the pond, how she'd fallen in, and how he'd reacted instantly to save her. He detailed his actions, his voice laced with the lingering anxiety of the near disaster. He expected understanding, perhaps even praise for his quick thinking. Instead, Mrs. Thompson's expression hardened. "So you admit you saw my daughter unattended near the pond?" Pete blinked, confusion clouding his relief. "Well, yes, but..." But nothing, Peter. Her voice rose, echoing across the manicured lawn. You were supposed to be watching the grounds, ensuring everything is safe. My daughter was nearly drowned because you weren't paying attention. This happened because you were negligent. Pete was stunned. Mrs. Thompson, I was working as always, and when I saw Lily fall, I reacted immediately. I saved her. I don't understand. Don't you see? Mrs. Thompson's voice was sharp, dismissive. If you had been properly monitoring the children, as you should have been, this would never have happened. Your heroics were completely unnecessary if you'd just been doing your job correctly. Mr. Thompson, who had remained silent until now, stepped forward, his face grim. Karen, perhaps? No, Robert, she cut him off, her anger blazing. This is unacceptable. Peter, I appreciate you pulled her out, but your lapse in judgment created this entire situation. We can't have someone working for us who creates such risks. Pete stood there, speechless, the injustice of her words washing over him. He had saved her daughter's life, and he was being blamed for it. He tried to reason with her, to explain again, but Mrs. Thompson was unmoved, her anger a solid, impenetrable wall. The next morning, a crisp white envelope was slipped under Pete's door. Inside, a brief, formal note informed him that his services were no longer required, effective immediately. He was dismissed, fired for saving a child's life. Pete left the Thompson estate with a heavy heart. He found another job quickly, maintaining the gardens of a smaller, less grand property a few miles away. The work was the same, but the joy was gone. He couldn't shake the memory of Mrs. Thompson's cold fury, the crushing unfairness of it all. He replayed the scene in his mind countless times, questioning if he could have done anything differently, but always arriving at the same conclusion. He had saved Lily, and for that, he had been punished. Weeks turned into a month. Pete continued his work, but a quiet sadness lingered in his eyes. Then, one quiet afternoon, as he was pruning roses in his new garden, a small shadow fell across the path. He looked up and saw Lily Thompson standing there. She looked smaller, more fragile than he remembered. Her bright pigtails were dull, and her usual sunny smile was absent, replaced by a solemn, almost mournful expression. She held a slightly crumpled envelope in her small hands. "Peter," she whispered, her voice barely audible. Pete's heart leapt. "Lily, what are you doing here, sweetheart?" She shuffled closer, her eyes fixed on the ground. "Mommy. Mommy said I should bring you this." She thrust the envelope into his hand, her fingers brushing his for a fleeting moment. Pete took the envelope, his hands trembling slightly. He looked at Lily, her sad, earnest face, and a wave of understanding washed over him. This wasn't just a letter, it was an apology, a plea. He opened the envelope and unfolded the letter. Mrs. Thompson's elegant script filled the page. The words were carefully chosen, but the message was clear. She admitted she had been wrong. Lily, it turned out, had been persistent, recounting the incident repeatedly, emphasizing Pete's bravery and kindness. Perhaps, in the quiet solitude of her own thoughts, Mrs. Thompson had finally allowed herself to see the situation from a different perspective. She wrote of her regret, her shame at her initial reaction, and her hope that Pete could find it in his heart to forgive her. And she extended an invitation for him to return to the Thompson estate. Pete read the letter twice, his gaze softening with each line. He looked back at Lily, who was watching him with wide, anxious eyes. A small, hesitant smile touched his lips. "Tell your mummy. Tell her thank you, Lily," he said softly, his voice thick with emotion. "And tell her, yes, I'll come back." As Lily's face broke into a radiant, relieved smile, Pete felt a weight lift from his soul. In the quiet of that afternoon, surrounded by the scent of roses and the gentle hum of bees, he realized something profound. Even in the face of misunderstanding, even when faced with unfairness and anger, the truth eventually has a way of blooming. Sometimes understanding takes time, and sometimes it arrives in the small outstretched hand of a child, carrying a message of forgiveness and a second chance. And in those moments, the most important lessons in life often reveal themselves, quiet and unassuming, like the gentle unfolding of a flower. Life lesson. Life often throws curveballs, and misunderstandings can arise even in the most unexpected situations. Mrs. Thompson's initial anger, while harsh, stemmed from fear and a protective instinct, albeit misdirected. Pete, in his quiet strength and dedication, exemplified patience and forgiveness. The story reminds us that even when we face unjust criticism or seemingly insurmountable disagreements, understanding and reconciliation are possible. It often takes time, empathy, and the courage to admit when we are wrong. And sometimes the most powerful catalysts for change are the innocent voices of children, guiding us back to compassion and truth.